The projection said compliance would occur in 43 hours. It had never been wrong. For 812 years, the Concordium's predictive engine had governed every war they chose to fight, every species they chose to subdue, and every outcome they allowed to unfold. Entire civilizations had folded under its calculations without a single shot fired, surrendering the moment the numbers reached them. Fear, after all, was just another variable. Loss tolerance, another curve. Survival instinct, a constant. Every species broke somewhere. The engine always knew where. So when the order came to neutralize a minor human outpost orbiting a dim, unremarkable star, no one in the command chamber treated it as anything more than procedure. The projection displayed its conclusion in clean, unambiguous text across the chamber's central hollow array. Total resistance collapse. 43 hours, 17 minutes. Casualty tolerance threshold exceeded at 12%. It was, by all measurable definitions, already over. The first strike was executed with surgical precision. From a low orbital angle, Concordium war platforms released a synchronized volley of focused energy lances that cut through the human defensive grid as if it had never existed. The outer ring of ships, 12 in total, disintegrated in seconds, their signatures vanishing from the tactical display so quickly it barely registered as loss. Debris scattered outward in silent arcs, glowing fragments dissolving into the black. Inside the chamber, no one reacted. There was nothing to react to. This was the part where resistance ended. Except it didn't. A junior systems officer, positioned near the rear console, was the first to notice it, not because he was more perceptive, but because he was still new enough to be paying attention to everything. His hand hovered uncertainly over the interface as he reran the feed, convinced he had misread the data. The surviving human ships weren't retreating. They were advancing. Not regrouping. Not repositioning. Advancing directly into the gap left by the destroyed vessels, accelerating into a field that had just been proven lethal beyond any rational threshold. Their damage readouts were catastrophic, hull integrity below operational minimum, propulsion systems failing in real time, yet their trajectory held steady, unwavering, as if loss had never been a factor in the equation. The officer hesitated, then spoke, his voice breaking the chamber's calm with an edge of uncertainty no one had heard in years. "Recalculation requested," he said. "Behavior does not align with projected response." There was a pause. Not long, just enough for the system to process. The predictive engine adjusted. It always adjusted. New projection, resistance collapse in 41 hours, 52 minutes. A minor variance. Within acceptable margins. The chamber relaxed again, if it had ever truly tensed. But the officer didn't sit down. Because something else had appeared, something small, almost insignificant, buried beneath the flood of tactical data streaming across his display. A fragment of intercepted communication, pulled from one of the advancing human vessels just before its signal degraded into static. It was incomplete, distorted, difficult to parse. But the translation resolved enough of it to be understood. Loss acknowledged, continue forward. The officer read it twice. Then a third time. And for the first time since the Concordium had begun charting the psychology of lesser species, a question surfaced in the room that had no immediate answer. If they had already exceeded their loss threshold, why were they still coming? The Concordium did not panic. Panic was an inefficiency, and inefficiencies had been systematically removed from their command structures centuries ago. What unfolded at the outpost was not interpreted as a failure, not yet. It was categorized as a deviation, small, contained, explainable. The predictive engine had already recalibrated twice, each iteration shaving minutes from the projected collapse window as it processed new behavioral inputs. The numbers still pointed in one direction. They always did. And yet the anomaly persisted. The advancing human ships did not slow, even as their formation thinned under sustained fire. One by one, their signatures vanished, but each disappearance only seemed to compress the remaining vessels tighter, forcing them deeper into the engagement zone. There was no visible attempt to preserve assets, no shift toward defensive posture, no broadcast indicating negotiation or withdrawal. Instead, what filtered through their fragmented communications was something far more difficult to categorize: short bursts of confirmation, acknowledgments of loss, and then the same repeated directive: continue. In the command chamber, that word began to circulate quietly among the analysts, not as a conclusion, but as a problem. Continue what? The Concordium doctrine was built on a single foundational truth: every intelligent species, when confronted with overwhelming force, would choose to preserve itself. It was not a moral judgment, it was a statistical certainty. Survival instinct governed all complex systems. When loss exceeded a calculable threshold, resistance ceased. That was the point of equilibrium, and the Concordium had spent centuries perfecting their ability to push opponents precisely to that point, and no further. It was efficient. It was predictable. It was universal. Or it had been. Requesting historical cross-reference, the same junior officer said, more quietly this time, as if lowering his voice might make the anomaly easier to contain. His console flickered as he accessed archived behavioral models across dozens of species, comparing the human response against known patterns of collapse. None matched. Not closely. Not even remotely. Across the chamber, a senior strategist observed the data with mild interest, the kind reserved for a puzzle that had not yet proven itself significant. Expand the data set, she said. Include pre-contact records. Cultural archives, if available. There was a brief hesitation. Human records were incomplete, fragmented, disorganized, filled with internal conflicts that had been deemed irrelevant during initial classification. A species that fought itself so frequently had been categorized as unstable, inefficient, and ultimately self-limiting. Not a priority. Still, the command was executed. Within minutes, the officer's display filled with centuries of human history, conflicts layered upon conflicts, wars within wars, patterns of destruction that did not converge toward stability but instead repeated, adapted, evolved. Entire regions devastated and rebuilt. Alliances formed and broken. Technologies repurposed not just for dominance, but for endurance. He scrolled faster, drawn in despite himself. The models struggled to interpret it. They flagged inconsistencies, contradictions, data that refused to resolve into clean predictive curves. Loss ratios that should have triggered collapse instead correlated with escalation. Populations that endured catastrophic damage did not stabilize. They reorganized, often becoming more efficient in the process. It was not rational in the Concordium sense of the word. It was something else. Preliminary analysis, the officer said, his voice steadier now but carrying an undercurrent of something new. Human conflict patterns do not converge toward minimum loss resolution. They exhibit sustained engagement beyond projected thresholds, repeatedly. A silence followed. This time, it was noticed. The strategist's gaze sharpened slightly, her attention shifting from casual oversight to focused evaluation. Define sustained. The officer hesitated, searching for language that would translate the data into something comprehensible within Concordium logic. They do not stop when the outcome becomes unfavorable, he said finally. They continue until something else changes. What changes? She asked. He looked at the screen, at the endless stream of historical records that refused to align with any known model. I don't know, he admitted. That uncertainty hung in the air longer than it should have. On the tactical display, the engagement continued to unfold. The number of active human vessels had dropped to 5. All were critically damaged. By every established metric, the conflict had already passed the point where surrender should have occurred. The predictive engine updated again. New projection. Resistance collapse in 39 hours, 11 minutes. Still inevitable. Still certain. And yet, as another human ship vanished from the display, its final transmission bleeding into static, the officer caught a fragment of audio that the system had not yet filtered. Not done. 2 words. Unstructured. Context incomplete. Meaning unclear. But they lingered in a way the projections did not. Because for the first time, the Concordium was not asking when the humans would stop. They were beginning to wonder if stopping had ever been part of the calculation at all. The Concordium did what it had always done when faced with inconsistency. It expanded the model. Within hours, additional processing layers were assigned to the human dataset, drawing from deeper archives, broader cultural inputs, and long-ignored pre-spaceflight records that had previously been dismissed as primitive noise. Entire sectors of the predictive engine were retasked, their elegant mathematical frameworks now straining to incorporate variables that did not behave as expected. The assumption was simple: no system was beyond comprehension. The flaw was in the data, not the doctrine. It had to be. But the deeper they looked, the worse the pattern became. The junior officer, now no longer overlooked, sat motionless before a cascade of human history that refused to simplify. Conflicts spanning centuries did not resolve toward efficiency. They did not trend toward optimization. Instead, they revealed something far more troubling: a repeated willingness to endure loss not as a failure state, but as part of an ongoing process. Entire populations subjected to devastation did not collapse in predictable ways. They adapted, reorganized, and in many cases returned with increased capacity for resistance. The system flagged the pattern as irrational. The officer began to suspect that the system was wrong. "Correlation identified," he said, more quietly now, as though speaking too loudly might cause the conclusion to fracture. "Loss tolerance does not reduce engagement probability. It increases it." The strategist turned fully toward him for the first time. "That contradicts baseline survival models," she replied. "Yes," he said. "It does." There was no immediate response to that. On the tactical display, the outpost engagement had stretched far beyond its expected timeline. Only 3 human vessels remained, each operating well below functional thresholds. Their movement was erratic, systems failing, trajectories inconsistent. Yet their behavior followed a different kind of logic. They were not reacting to immediate threats in isolation. They were positioning themselves with an awareness that extended beyond their individual survival. They were thinking beyond themselves. A new alert surfaced, unexpected, unpredicted. One of the damaged human ships executed a maneuver that no Concordium model had accounted for. It diverted power from life support, from structural stabilization, from every non-essential system, channeling everything into propulsion and a single forward weapon. The ship accelerated past safe operational limits, its hull beginning to fragment under the strain, and drove itself directly into a Concordium weapons platform. The impact was not strategically significant, but it was not supposed to happen at all. The chamber stilled, not because of the damage, minimal, contained, but because the act itself did not exist within any known behavioral framework. It was not efficient. It did not improve survival probability. It did not serve immediate tactical advantage. It made no sense. Why would they do that? One of the analysts asked, the question escaping before it could be filtered. No one answered. Because the system did not have one. The predictive engine recalculated again, its projections adjusting to account for the anomaly. Time to collapse shortened by another marginal fraction. It compensated, as it always did, smoothing the irregularity into the broader curve of inevitability. But the officer saw what the numbers did not. It wasn't smoothing. It was ignoring. He shifted to another dataset, human communications, both historical and current, searching not for patterns of action, but for patterns of thought. Language, after all, revealed intent in ways behavior sometimes concealed. He filtered for recurring concepts, thematic consistencies, ideas that appeared across time despite technological and cultural evolution. One word began to surface with increasing frequency. Not a direct translation. Not a precise equivalent in Concordium language. But the closest approximation was endurance. Not survival. Not victory. Endurance. He leaned back slightly, the realization settling into place with a weight that felt disproportionate to its simplicity. The Concordium model was built on the assumption that species sought to minimize loss. That survival was the endpoint of all decision-making. But what if that wasn't the endpoint? What if, for humans, survival was just the starting condition? On the display, the final 2 human vessels continued their advance, systems collapsing in real time, trajectories unstable, yet still closing the distance. Their signals flickered, faded, reappeared, each moment of continued existence seeming less like a calculation and more like a refusal. Another fragment of communication broke through, clearer this time, the translation stabilizing just long enough to be understood. "Hold the line." The officer stared at it. There was no line. Not in any tactical sense. No defensive perimeter, no strategic boundary that justified the phrase. The outpost was already lost by every measurable standard. And yet they were holding something. Or trying to. "Strategic question," the officer said, his voice low but steady. "What if their objective is not to win this engagement?" The strategist's gaze narrowed. "Clarify." He hesitated not because he lacked the thought, but because he understood what it implied. "What if their objective is to continue the conflict?" he said. Regardless of outcome. The chamber fell into a deeper silence than before. Because that idea, more than any anomaly, more than any unexpected maneuver, did not fit anywhere in the Concordium's understanding of war. Conflicts ended. They always had. That was the point. But as the final human vessel accelerated toward a position it could not possibly hold, its systems failing, its signal degrading into noise, a new possibility began to form, one that no projection had yet accounted for. What if this one didn't? The Concordium escalated. Not out of fear. Fear required recognition of threat, but out of procedural necessity. The engagement at the outpost had exceeded acceptable variance, and variance demanded correction. Additional fleets were dispatched, heavier assets repositioned, command hierarchies reinforced. The anomaly would be contained, studied, and resolved like every deviation before it. That was the expectation. Reality, however, began to move in a direction the system could no longer comfortably describe. By the time reinforcements arrived, the outpost was no longer a single point of resistance. It had become something else entirely, an anchor. Human forces from neighboring sectors had converged, not in organized formations dictated by centralized command, but in fragmented waves that seemed to arrive independently, each unit operating with incomplete information yet aligning toward a shared objective. Their coordination was not precise in the Concordium sense, but it was effective. Disturbingly so. "They are not waiting for orders," one analyst observed, reviewing the incoming data streams. "Command latency is inconsistent. Decision-making is occurring at the unit level. That reduces efficiency," another replied automatically. "It should," the first said. But it didn't. The Concordium fleet initiated a second strike, larger, more decisive, designed to reassert control over the engagement space. Precision fire carved through the newly arrived human vessels, eliminating targets at a rate that should have triggered immediate collapse. The projections updated accordingly. New projection, resistance collapse in 36 hours, 08 minutes. Still inevitable. Still certain. But the numbers were beginning to feel disconnected. Because every time the Concordium increased pressure, the human response did not diminish, it expanded. New ships entered the field faster than anticipated, their designs varied, their configurations inconsistent, as if drawn from multiple production lines operating without standardized optimization. Some were clearly outdated, retrofitted with improvised systems. Others displayed unfamiliar modifications, weapon integrations that had not appeared in prior engagements. They were not uniform. They were adapting. Production analysis requested, the junior officer said, now operating with a confidence that came less from rank and more from necessity. His earlier findings had not been dismissed outright, but they had not been accepted either. They existed in a liminal space, acknowledged, yet not integrated. The data came back faster than expected. And it was worse than anticipated. Human manufacturing output had increased across multiple sectors simultaneously, far exceeding the baseline capacity established during initial contact. Facilities previously classified as civilian had been converted to military production. Supply chains had rerouted, optimizing not for efficiency, but for speed. The result was not elegant. It was overwhelming. "They are not minimizing loss," the officer said, more to himself than to the chamber. "They are compensating for it." The strategist stepped closer, her attention now fully engaged, the earlier detachment replaced by something sharper, more analytical. Explain. They expect to lose, he said. So they build faster than they lose. The simplicity of the statement was what made it dangerous, because it implied a system that did not break under pressure, but absorbed it. On the tactical display, the battle expanded beyond the original engagement zone. Human vessels continued to arrive, not in coordinated fleets, but in a continuous stream. Small groups, individual ships, anything capable of reaching the conflict. Some lasted minutes. Others survived longer, their actions unpredictable, their decisions made without waiting for confirmation from any higher authority. The Concordium's response protocols struggled to keep pace. Their doctrine was built on structured engagements, on predictable reactions, on the assumption that opponents would behave within defined parameters. But here, the parameters shifted constantly, rewritten in real time by countless independent actors who did not pause to seek approval. The gap between action and response, the space where the Concordium had always maintained control, was shrinking, and in some cases, disappearing entirely. Recalculation requested, the strategist said, her voice controlled, precise. The predictive engine complied. New projection, resistance collapse in 38 hours, 52 minutes. The number increased. That had never happened before. A subtle change easily overlooked by anyone not watching closely. But in a system defined by steady convergence toward resolution, an extension of the timeline was not just an anomaly. It was a warning. No one spoke immediately, because acknowledging it required accepting that the conflict was not progressing toward its expected conclusion. It was drifting. And drift, in a system designed for certainty, was dangerous. The junior officer shifted his focus again, returning to the human historical records, searching not for patterns of collapse, but for moments where similar conditions had occurred, where loss had escalated, where pressure had increased, where any other species would have reached its threshold. He found them. Not once. Not twice. Dozens of times. Different eras. Different technologies. Different contexts. Same outcome. They didn't stop. He felt the realization settle in, heavier now, more defined. This isn't a deviation, he said quietly. The strategist did not look away from the display. Clarify. He swallowed, aware that what he was about to say would not fit within any established framework. It's a pattern, he said. The words hung there. Because if it was a pattern, then it wasn't going away. On the tactical display, another wave of human vessels entered the engagement zone, their trajectories converging with the same relentless momentum as before. And for the first time since the Concordium had begun its expansion across the stars, the question was no longer how long the resistance would last. It was how long the Concordium could keep up. The Concordium deployed the null array. It had never failed. Across centuries of expansion, the null array was not merely a weapon, it was a conclusion. A construct of immense scale, capable of collapsing entire operational zones into controlled void states where resistance ceased to function in any meaningful way. It did not rely on overwhelming firepower alone. It disrupted coordination, severed communication pathways, and reduced complex systems into isolated fragments unable to act cohesively. Against every known species, its activation had marked the precise moment where resistance transitioned into surrender. The humans were notified. That, too, was standard procedure. The Concordium did not conceal inevitability. They presented it. The logic was simple. Once a species understood the scale of what was approaching, the calculation would resolve itself. No civilization had ever chosen to endure what the null array represented. They did not need to experience it. The anticipation was enough. The message was transmitted with exact coordinates, projected activation timeline, and the same language that had ended wars for generations. A window was given. 72 hours. Plenty of time to make the correct decision. The response came faster than expected. Not a surrender code. Not a request for negotiation. Not even a delay signal. It was data. Unstructured at first glance, fragmented, layered across multiple channels, but unmistakably deliberate. Tactical overlays, targeting telemetry, structural analyses of the array itself, compiled, distributed, and updated in real time across every active human unit in the sector. They weren't preparing to survive it. They were preparing to engage it. In the command chamber, the shift was immediate. "That is not a valid response," one analyst said, the words sounding insufficient even as they left his mouth. "No," the strategist replied, her tone quieter now, stripped of its earlier certainty. "It isn't." But it was happening. Across the expanding engagement zone, human vessels altered their trajectories, not away from the projected field of the null array, but toward it. Production output surged again, new ships entering the field at a rate that no longer aligned with any previous model. Their designs grew more specialized, more focused, as if the entire industrial capacity of their civilization had reoriented around a single objective. They were not dispersing. They were concentrating. "Projection update," the strategist ordered. The predictive engine hesitated. Not in a mechanical sense. It processed as it always had, but the output did not resolve cleanly. The curves that had once converged with elegant precision now fractured, branching into multiple potential outcomes that refused to collapse into a single line. Primary projection unavailable. That had never appeared before. Secondary models attempted to compensate, each offering a different timeline, a different probability, none of them carrying the absolute certainty that had defined the Concordium's strategic dominance for centuries. "Refine parameters," she said. The system complied. The results did not improve. Because the core assumption, the one everything else depended on, no longer held. That loss would lead to cessation. It wasn't. On the tactical display, the first elements of the null array began to emerge from fold space, their massive structures unfolding into position with slow, deliberate precision. They dominated the visual field, dwarfing everything around them, their presence alone enough to render most forms of resistance meaningless. Under any other circumstances, this was the moment where the opposing force would break. Instead, human vessels accelerated. Not blindly, not chaotically, deliberately. They moved in patterns that were not dictated by a central command, yet aligned with a shared understanding that extended across the entire engagement space. Individual units adjusted in real time, compensating for losses, exploiting gaps, redistributing roles without waiting for instruction. The effect was not perfect coordination. It was something more dangerous. It was adaptive. "They're learning," the junior officer said, the realization no longer tentative. "They're responding," the strategist corrected automatically. "No," he said, his voice steady now, anchored by the data in front of him. "They're improving." The distinction mattered. Because response implied reaction. Improvement implied direction. The first human strike against the null array was not significant in terms of damage. A small vessel, barely operational, diverted everything it had into a single focused attack, impacting one of the array's outer structures before disintegrating under the strain. By itself, it meant nothing. But it wasn't alone. Another followed. Then another. Each one slightly different. Adjusted. Refined. Targeting points shifted incrementally, focusing on structural weaknesses that had not been apparent until moments before. Data from each failed attempt propagated instantly across the network, informing the next, and the next, and the next. The Concordium had designed the array to withstand assault. They had not designed it to be studied in real time by an opponent that did not stop attacking. "Casualty rate exceeds all projections," an analyst reported, his voice tight now, the first sign of strain breaking through the chamber's composure. "Yes," the strategist said. She did not look away from the display. Because for the first time, the scale of what they were facing was becoming clear, not as a collection of anomalies, not as a series of deviations, but as a fundamentally different kind of system. One that did not converge toward resolution. One that did not seek equilibrium. One that grew stronger the longer it was engaged. The null array continued its deployment, its structures locking into place, its activation sequence progressing exactly as designed. And yet, surrounding it, pressing in from every direction, human forces continued to multiply, to adapt, to close the distance with a persistence that no projection could contain. The junior officer looked at the fractured outputs of the predictive engine, at the branching timelines that refused to settle, and understood something that the system could not articulate. This was no longer a war the Concordium could finish. It was becoming a war the humans could continue. And those were not the same thing. The null array activated. Space itself seemed to dim as its field expanded outward, a controlled distortion that bent signals, fractured coordination, and isolated every object caught within its reach. Across the tactical display, human formations began to fragment, not by choice, but by force. Communication lines collapsed into static, synchronized targeting dissolved, and the once fluid movement of their forces broke into scattered, disconnected elements. For a brief moment, the Concordium saw something familiar again. Disorder. This was how it was supposed to look. This is the collapse phase, one analyst said, relief threading through his voice. Coordination loss confirmed. Engagement degradation in progress. The predictive engine, though still fractured, aligned partially with the observation. Several of its models converged on a narrower window of outcomes, suggesting that without communication, human resistance would degrade into isolated, ineffective actions. The system began to stabilize. Not fully, but enough. The strategist watched the display carefully, searching for confirmation that the anomaly had finally reached its limit. The null array was functioning exactly as intended. No species could operate effectively under these conditions. No centralized force could maintain cohesion once its structure was disrupted at this level. This was where it ended. Except it didn't, because the fragmentation didn't slow the humans. It accelerated them. Without centralized communication, each human unit acted independently, but not randomly. Their movements retained a strange, underlying coherence, as if every ship carried not just orders, but intent. They did not pause to re-establish contact. They did not attempt to regroup. They continued. Individually. Simultaneously. Relentlessly. They're not trying to reconnect, the junior officer said, his voice low, almost disbelieving. They're operating as if they expected this. The strategist's gaze sharpened. That is not possible. But the data said otherwise. Each human vessel, isolated within the null field, executed decisions that aligned with the broader objective without needing external input. Targeting remained consistent. Pressure points on the array were still being exploited. Even without shared data, the pattern persisted. It was no longer coordination. It was architecture. They built their system for failure, the officer said, the realization settling fully into place. They assume communication will break. They assume command will disappear. So every unit carries enough of the plan to continue without it. A silence followed that was heavier than any before it. Because that meant the null array, designed to collapse systems, was no longer a decisive advantage. It was just another condition. On the display, Concordium platforms began to take sustained damage. Not catastrophic, not yet, but far beyond projected tolerances. Human vessels, individually insignificant, were collectively overwhelming. Each loss fed into the next action, each failed strike refining the next attempt. They weren't just enduring the array. They were learning inside it. Casualty reports, an analyst said, his tone tighter now, the controlled calm beginning to fracture. Concordium losses exceed modeled thresholds by a factor of 4. The number hung in the air. It was wrong. Not just inaccurate, impossible. The Concordium did not sustain losses at this scale in controlled engagements. Their entire doctrine was built to avoid it. Precision, calculation, efficiency, these were not ideals. They were constants. And now, they were failing. Update projections, the strategist said, her voice still steady, but stripped of certainty. The predictive engine attempted to comply. The output did not stabilize. Instead of converging, the models diverged further, branching into timelines that extended outward indefinitely, some suggesting outcomes that had never been considered: prolonged engagement, resource depletion, systemic strain. No resolution. No clean endpoint. For the first time, the system could not define when the conflict would end. Across the wider sector, the consequences began to ripple outward. External observers, civilizations that had long accepted the Concordium's dominance as a fixed constant, began to adjust their own models. Quietly at first. Subtly, defensive postures shifted. Resource allocations changed. The assumption of inevitability, once unchallenged, began to erode. Because the Concordium was no longer demonstrating control. It was demonstrating resistance. And that distinction mattered. Back in the command chamber, the strategist finally stepped away from the central display, not out of retreat, but to see it from a different perspective, to understand the shape of the conflict beyond the immediate data. What is their objective? She asked. No one answered immediately, because the question itself had changed. It was no longer about winning. It was about continuation. The junior officer looked at the data, at the endless stream of human vessels entering the engagement, at the production numbers that continued to rise, at the casualty reports that should have broken any other force. They're not trying to end this, he said. The strategist turned slightly, her expression unreadable. Then what are they trying to do? He hesitated, because the answer was simple and terrifying. They're trying to outlast it, he said. The words settled into the chamber with a weight that no projection could quantify. Because the Concordium had never fought a war that required endurance. Their conflicts were designed to end. Quickly, efficiently, predictably. But this one was stretching, expanding, refusing to resolve. On the tactical display, the null array continued to operate, its field stable, its function intact. And yet, within it, human forces pressed forward without hesitation, without pause, without any indication that the conditions imposed on them had changed anything at all. The Concordium had reached the peak of its escalation. And it wasn't enough. The realization did not arrive all at once. It spread, slow, inevitable, impossible to ignore. They had deployed their greatest weapon. And the humans had treated it like a phase. Not an ending. Just another step. And if this was only a step, then what came next? The first time the Concordium admitted something was wrong, it did not happen in the command chamber. It happened in the numbers. Not the projections, they had already fractured beyond usefulness, but the raw figures beneath them. Resource expenditure curves no longer aligned with replenishment cycles. Fleet rotation schedules began to overlap. Maintenance intervals shortened beyond safe margins. For a civilization that had engineered war into a closed, predictable system, the sudden appearance of strain was not just unexpected. It was unacceptable. And yet, it was happening. The strategist stood alone before a consolidated display, no longer the elegant, singular projection of inevitability, but a layered compilation of everything the system could still measure. Losses, production, engagement duration, logistical throughput. Each metric told the same story from a different angle. The Concordium was still winning every individual exchange. And losing the war. She studied the progression carefully, tracing the curve that no longer curved, a line that had flattened, stretched, and then begun to tilt in a direction that had never existed in their models before. Not collapse. Not victory. Persistence. Behind her, the chamber remained active, analysts working in controlled silence, their movements efficient but no longer effortless. There was hesitation now. Micro-delays. Moments where decisions required thought instead of automatic execution. That alone would have been unthinkable months ago. Full conflict review, she said, her voice carrying across the room with quiet authority. From initial engagement to current state. No filters. The data flooded in. Every phase of the war unfolded in sequence. The initial strike, the anomaly, the escalation, the deployment of the null array. Each moment that had been treated as a contained deviation now revealed itself as part of a continuous pattern. Not random. Not chaotic. Consistent. Every time the Concordium increased pressure, the human response adapted. Every time a threshold was reached, it was not a breaking point, but a transition. Losses that should have ended the conflict instead fueled its continuation. Disruption that should have fractured coordination instead revealed a deeper, more resilient structure. They had not been reacting. They had been progressing. The strategist's gaze narrowed slightly as she reached the midpoint, the deployment of the null array. The moment that should have resolved everything. The moment that had instead marked the beginning of something else. Isolate this segment, she said. The display shifted, focusing on the period immediately following activation. The fragmentation of human forces, the loss of communication, the expected collapse. And then the continuation. Independent units acting with shared intent. No central command. No synchronization. And yet the pressure remained constant. More than constant, it increased. They anticipated it, she said, not as a question. The junior officer, now standing closer to the central console than his rank would normally allow, nodded slowly. Their doctrine assumes failure at every level, he said. They don't build systems that require stability. They build systems that function without it. The strategist absorbed that in silence. Because it meant the Concordium's greatest advantage, its ability to disrupt and control, was no longer decisive. It was expected. And their objective? She asked. The officer hesitated, not because he lacked the answer, but because saying it aloud made it real. They're not trying to defeat us in a single engagement, he said. They're shaping the conflict itself. A ripple moved through the chamber, not panic, not even alarm, but something deeper. Recognition. Because that implied something the Concordium had never needed to consider. That the war was not a series of engagements. It was a system. And the humans were rewriting it. On the tactical display, Concordium forces executed another large-scale maneuver, an attempt to reassert control, to compress the engagement space, to force the humans into a defined boundary where their advantage could be applied with precision. It worked. Temporarily. Human vessels were pushed back, their lines compressed, their losses increasing at a rate that would have shattered any other force. The display reflected it clearly, declining numbers, deteriorating positions, a narrowing operational zone. For a moment, it looked like collapse. The chamber leaned into it not physically, but in focus, in expectation. This was the pattern they understood. This was the moment where the system should resolve. And then the human response came. Not as a counterattack. As an expansion. Signals appeared beyond the compressed zone, new vessels, fresh trajectories, emerging from sectors that had not previously been active. Production centers that had not been identified as military assets came online, feeding into the conflict with a speed that defied logistical logic. The boundary didn't hold. It broke outward. They're opening new fronts, an analyst said, his voice tight now, no longer masking the strain. No, the strategist replied, her tone quieter, more precise. They're refusing to be contained. The distinction was subtle, but it changed everything. Because containment was the foundation of Concordium warfare. Define the space. Control the variables. Drive the opponent toward resolution. But the humans were not moving toward resolution. They were moving away from it. Expanding the conflict beyond any single engagement, beyond any single system, turning it into something that could not be neatly defined or concluded. The strategist stepped back again, seeing the pattern not as isolated events, but as a whole. And in that moment, the realization crystallized. Not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, irreversible shift. We cannot end this, she said. No one spoke. Because everyone understood what she meant. Not with current doctrine. Not with current assumptions. Not with a system designed for opponents who eventually chose to stop. The junior officer looked at the display, at the endless stream of human activity, at the way the conflict continued to evolve, to grow, to refuse every endpoint imposed upon it. They don't have a stopping point, he said. The strategist turned slightly, her expression no longer unreadable, now carrying the faintest trace of something new. Understanding. Neither do we, she replied. But even as she said it, both of them knew the truth. The Concordium had always had a stopping point. It was built into their system. Built into their calculations. Built into their belief that every war could be finished. The humans had never believed that. And that was the difference. On the display, another wave of human vessels entered the expanding conflict zone, their numbers no longer surprising, only confirming what had already become clear. This was not a war that would reach a breaking point. It was approaching something else entirely. Something the Concordium had no model for. Something they had never needed to imagine. What happens when the enemy doesn't break? And neither side can stop. The message was not sent immediately. For a civilization that had spent centuries mastering the art of decisive action, hesitation was unfamiliar territory. It moved through the Concordium command structure like a quiet disruption, unspoken, unmeasured, but present in every delay, every recalculation, every moment where certainty had once lived and now did not. The strategist stood at the center of the chamber, the fractured projections still suspended in the air around her, each one offering a different version of a future that no longer resolved cleanly. The war had stretched beyond its intended shape, beyond its intended duration, beyond anything the Concordium had ever defined as acceptable. And still it continued. Not because the Concordium could not fight, but because the humans would not stop. That was the difference. It had taken them too long to understand it. "Prepare diplomatic channel," she said at last, her voice steady, stripped of anything unnecessary. Direct transmission. No framing language. A pause followed, not resistance, but adjustment. The command did not fit any existing template. There were protocols for surrender demands, for conditional negotiations, for post-conflict settlements. There was no protocol for this. Still, the order was executed. Across the vast expanse of contested space, where fleets still maneuvered and weapons still fired and the null array still pulsed with controlled distortion, a new signal emerged, clear, precise, unmistakably intentional. It carried no threat, no demand, just a question. The transmission reached human command structures in fragmented pieces, routed through decentralized networks that no longer relied on singular points of authority. It propagated outward, passing from unit to unit, node to node, until it reached the individuals who could interpret it, not because they held rank, but because they held context. It arrived, eventually, where it needed to. And for the first time since the war began, the Concordium waited. Not for collapse. For an answer. The response did not come from a single source. It formed. Across the human network, fragments of communication aligned, coalescing into something coherent. Not because they were directed to, but because they shared the same understanding. There was no delay for approval, no pause for consensus. They already had it. When the reply transmitted back across the void, it was simple. 3 words. Unambiguous. Unadorned. Entirely sufficient. We keep going. The translation resolved instantly. The chamber went still. Not in shock. In recognition. Because everything they had observed, every anomaly, every deviation, every failure of the predictive system, it all aligned with those 3 words. Not as an explanation, but as a statement of fact. This was not a strategy. It was a condition. The strategist closed her eyes briefly, not in defeat, not in resignation, but in the quiet acknowledgement of something that could no longer be denied. The Concordium had not encountered a stronger opponent. They had encountered a different kind of one. One that did not measure war the same way. One that did not seek resolution through efficiency or equilibrium. One that did not treat loss as a signal to stop. The display shifted again, not because the system had found a new projection, but because the data itself had changed. Human production continued to rise. New vessels entered the conflict at a rate that no longer surprised anyone. External observers, once passive, had begun to reposition themselves, their own calculations shifting in response to a reality that no longer matched the old models. The Concordium was still powerful, still advanced, still capable of overwhelming force. But for the first time, that power existed inside a system it did not control. The strategist opened her eyes. "Cease offensive escalation," she said. The words moved through the chamber with quiet finality. Not an admission of defeat, but an acknowledgement of limits. Because continuing as they had been was no longer a path to victory. It was a path to exhaustion. The war did not end in a moment. It did not collapse into a single decisive event. It shifted. Gradually. Inevitably. Concordium fleets pulled back to defensive positions, not retreating, but no longer advancing with the same certainty. Engagements became less frequent, less aggressive, as both sides adjusted to a new equilibrium, one not defined by dominance, but by endurance. The conflict had not been won in the way the Concordium understood victory. But it had been transformed. And that transformation was irreversible. Across the broader galaxy, the implications spread. Civilizations that had once accepted the Concordium's dominance as a fixed constant began to re-evaluate. Not with open defiance, not yet, but with subtle shifts in posture, in preparation, in possibility. The idea that the Concordium could be resisted, truly resisted, had not existed before. Now it did. Because the humans had proven something no one else had. Not that they could win, but that they could continue. Indefinitely. Back in the command chamber, the predictive engine remained active, its processes running, its models attempting to adapt to a reality that no longer fit its original design. It would evolve, eventually. It always had. But it would never be the same. Because its core assumption had been broken. Not every system converges. Not every conflict resolves. Some persist. The junior officer stood at his console, looking at the data not as a problem to solve, but as a record of something unprecedented. He thought back to the first anomaly, the first moment the humans had advanced when they should have retreated, the first fragment of communication that had not made sense. It made sense now. They had never been trying to survive the war. They had been prepared to live inside it. He exhaled slowly, the weight of that understanding settling into place. Across the display, human vessels continued to move, repairing, rebuilding, repositioning, not with urgency, not with desperation, but with a steady, unbroken rhythm that no longer needed to prove itself. They were still there. Still active. And for the first time, the Concordium understood what that meant. Not just for this war, but for every war that would come after.